Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking with American professors of Russian studies and their insight about Russian studies and their insights into Russian culture, how they teach Russian culture in American colleges and universities, and their experiences about what led them to Russia. Our topic today is Russian culture at the turn of the 20th century, with Professor Thomas Seifrid of the University of Southern California. As you know, this program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. And if you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post comments and questions at any time. For Russian subtitles, you can select closed captioning in Russian. So let's get started. A little bit about our guest, Thomas Seifrid. Professor Seifrid studies and teaches 20th century Russian literature and culture, particularly that of the Soviet 1920s and 1930s, Russian philosophy of language of the late 19th to mid-20th centuries, the life and works of Vladimir Nabokov, and Polish language and culture, among many other things, which we'll talk about today. So, Tom, I want to welcome you to the Culture Connection.
Thank you, Michael.
It's great to see you. I will say on a personal note, I wanted you to kick us off with this series because you were one of the first people I talked to about my own project, which bridged 19th and 20th century Russia, my documentary about Pushkin. Mm-hmm. I think, you were the first professor I talked to about that original concept, and you led me to some really interesting professors, some of whom have been our guests on this program. And I appreciate that, and it's great to see you again. And today we're going to talk about that bridge between the 19th and 20th centuries. So why don't we start off with a little bit about yourself? It's a very personal conversation. I want to get to know you. Tell us about your path to Russian studies, and tell us how you started in Montana, where you started out studying wildlife biology and Russian, which for us is a first.
It's an interesting story. Thank you for asking, because in a sense, I backed into it. I never thought, at least when I was a young man, that I would be doing this, being a professor of Russian literature and culture. And the way it started was I grew up in the Chicago area, and I wanted to become a wildlife biologist. I wanted to study wild animals in places like Montana, Alaska, wherever. And so I had enrolled in the University of Montana in their wildlife biology program. And the beginning of my first year, I had a little room in my schedule, and I was leafing through. In those years, the schedule of classes was on paper. So I'm leafing through it thinking, what on earth am I going to take to fill up the slot for one more course? And I saw they offered Russian. And so the funny part about that is when I was in high school, my best friend and I were in a course on world history together. And there was a photograph in the textbook of Nikita Khrushchev doing something at some plenum, whatever. And in the photograph, of course, there was some party slogan in Cyrillic. And we looked at this and we said, what on earth is this alphabet? And we looked the alphabet up in the dictionary, which gave correspondences, P is P, and so on and so forth. And we memorized this alphabet and started writing one another notes in English, but using Cyrillic, transliterating English into Cyrillic, because we thought, nobody else can read this. And then we sort of dropped that. So it was this odd little thing. And then sitting there in my dormitory room, University of Montana, I thought, well, what the heck? I will take Russian because I know this alphabet, and maybe I'll learn how to say a couple of phrases, and that will be it. And I took it, and then I got more and more interested, and it was not easy because I had most of my studies were in biology and things like that. And then what really changed it for me was this was an era in US-Soviet, as they were then, relations known as détente. Under Brezhnev and then President Gerald Ford, relations were warming between the countries. And at that point, the date would have been something like 1976, 74, 75, 76. The two countries had signed an agreement opening up scholarly exchanges so that Soviet scientists and scholars could travel to the United States and vice versa. And so I went with what I think was one of the second or third groups to go study Russian. And I first went on a trip in the summer. It was a summer trip, kind of half tourist, half study in Leningrad and then Moscow. And then I went back during my senior year of college. And after that trip in my senior year of college, I had decided that this is what I really wanted to do. And another turning point was I was in the summer, I think before my senior year, last year of college, I was in the field. We were trying to trap grizzly bears.
Oh, in that field.
What's that?
In that field.
Out in the mountains of Montana. And I suddenly realized, and I really had two revelations. One was there's a lot of physical labor goes into doing biological research of that kind, hiking up and down mountains, and with no trails, just finding places where bears had been sighted, doing surveys of the vegetation. It was a lot of physical work, which I found interesting, but the amount of physical work relative to the intellectual reward was significant. And then we would return. We were living in a cabin, a wooden, house in the mountains. And I found myself looking forward to, I had a Dostoevsky novel with me. I think it was probably Brothers Karamazov, Bratya Karamazovi. And I found myself in the evening really looking forward to getting back and reading Dostoevsky. And then I thought, well, maybe this is an indication of where I should go. So I decided to go to graduate school and study Russian literature. Never quite got rid of the attraction to the wildlife biology and those things. So my students hear a lot about things. We're currently, in the class I'm currently teaching, for example, we're reading Anna Karenina. And when Oblonsky and Levin go hunting and they shoot a waldschnapp, they see a slide of what that is. Or there's a scene in which Levin has a bear skin, and I say to them, do you know what species of bear this would have been? Of course, they don't know what that is. So they get a little annotation about the biological side of things. So that's how I ended up doing this.
That's great. So I see this this fast forwarding from the wilds of Montana to sunny Los Angeles and the hallowed halls of University of Southern California. I'm from South Carolina, so I always want to call USC.
That's the other USC.
I know. My niece is there now. I always want to refer to South Carolina. Tell us about the Russian program there and the students who are interested in Russian culture, who are studying Anna Karenina. What's the atmosphere like for Russian studies in colleges today?
The University of Southern California is a little unusual, or rather, we're like some universities in America, but not like others. And so we have now, unfortunately, a relatively low number of students who are actually, as it is called in American parlance, majoring in Russia, where this is their main subject of study. This is what they receive a degree in. The course I'm teaching now, which is simply called the Russian novel, and it's the 19th century novel, is what is known as a general education course. These are students, I have students who are studying architecture, art history, engineering, and so forth, who are required by the university to take a broad range of courses in various categories, and this is one of the categories in literature and culture. So I get students I myself tend to get students who are not necessarily interested in Russian as a career. There are those students. What's typical at our university is that those students will combine the study of Russian with the study of something else. We've had students who are studying Russian and music. We've had students who are studying Russian and pharmacy. Often we have a number of students at our university who are immigrants from Armenia, but they are Russophone, so they speak Russian. and as well as a number of children of people who emigrated at some point from Russia. And it's wonderful to have those students in my class because they know some things I'm talking about. And, so the rest of the students don't think I'm strange or Russia is strange or something like that. So now I mentioned that this is characteristic of the University of Southern California. There are other universities where more students are interested in things like history, literature, culture. Our students happen to be more interested in professional things, engineering, business, and so forth. So we're a little unusual, but we get a small but good group of students.
Right. And so what in the Russian novel, course on the Russian novel, what are you teaching besides Anna Karenina?
We start out reading Evgeny Onegin in translation, which is, I have to tell them over and over and over again, learn Russian because then you can read this in the original and it's wonderful. In translation, it's very difficult to find a really good translation. The one I use is serviceable. It works, but what's that?
Who is it? Who is the translator?
I'm trying to think. It's the Oxford one. It's the name will come to me because he was a scholar of Russian literature as well. There are two. There's a Penguin edition and the Oxford one. And it's the one I use. If I had it on my shelf, I could pull it off and read. But so we read Evgeny Onegin. We read followed by Dead Souls, Mертвые души, followed by Turgenev, Fathers and Children, as it is now correctly titled in English. It used to be titled Fathers and Sons. And now we're reading Anna Karenina. And they learned from me that in the Russian language, you do something that is called in linguistics geminating, meaning if you have a double consonant, you pronounce it longer. It's not Anna Karenina, it's Anna Karenina. They learn a lot of details that they probably wish they didn't learn. And I delight in telling them. So in class, every session, I do visual PowerPoint presentations, and I absolutely delight in showing them things like a samovar. What is a samovar? It shows up in this literature all over the place. And what is a samovar? What is kvass? And I point out to them, you can order kvass in the United States on Amazon. I have no idea how good it is, but you can how authentic it is. And yesterday, there's a moment in Anna Karenina when Levin opens the fortechka. And so it is actually footnoted in our edition, but I said, okay, here's a fortechka. And I showed them a fortechka, and then I told them about sealing windows in the winter. And a lot of my students are from California. And actually in this particular class, I have two students from China, and I have a student from Dubai. And so it was hot early in the fall in Los Angeles, and she said, oh, this is nothing. In Dubai, it's like this all year round. So I'm explaining things like snow to them and winter. So, but that's what we read. And I also in my presentations, if there's a word like kvass, I will put it up in Cyrillic. And I tell them, don't worry, I'm not going to test you. This is not on the exam, but I would like you to see this, beautiful Cyrillic alphabet. And maybe here and there you will pick up some letters, and so you can read it. Maybe I'm kind of subconsciously trying to get them to do what I did, which is fall in love with the alphabet and then want to learn Russian.
That's wonderful. I mean, all of those Russian novels are so good, and they're all in their own way such an interesting window into life. And so to bring in those different aspects, especially the fortechka, I feel like everyone needs one of those. Perhaps not in Dubai, but it's a very useful little window. So in this series, we're talking about that bridge from the 19th century to the 20th century, how everything changed, and fin de siècle, Russia and the revolution, what stayed, what was thrown out. And wanted to talk to you a little bit about that general theme today, and then we're going to talk about your recent book as well. But can you tell us about the state of Russian culture at the beginning of the 20th century, and what were some of the big themes of how culture evolved as the Soviet Union was formed?
So, well, the beginning of the century and the formation of the Soviet Union are slightly separate
separate things,
separated by about 20 years, as I'm sure you know, Michael. And what is characteristic of the late 19th century moving into the early 20th century is a very interesting shift. And I tell my students this. So the students in the Russian novel course hear a lot about novels and why are novels so long. Students often groan because they're reading, Tolstoy wrote a lot. And I pointed out, we just in Anna Karenina yesterday, we're talking about the scene in which, if anyone remembers this, Levin proposes to Kitty by writing the first initial of the words of what he wants to say. And Kitty looks at it and somehow figures it out. And first I said to my students, this is like texting. Only, you can't text like a string of 15 first letters. But I tell them that in the 19th century, there was a sense that somehow all of life could be encompassed in an art form. Symphonic music and novels. The reason novels are long is they're trying to encompass everything. And they also believe that change is what is essential, is what defines us, what we are, what we have become. So we're not static, and that process is all what the novel's about. That changes for a variety of interesting reasons. And around 1880, there's a kind of sea shift. It's very subtle, but looking back, you can see a big division where the novel in Russia, and I think across Europe, no longer is the privileged genre, the form in which we express what we think about life. Other forms become important. The short story, the transition from Tolstoy to Chekhov, a writer like Chekhov, who initially begins writing one-page comedy sketches to make a little money while he's in medical school. And this evolves obviously into, major artistic accomplishment by Chekhov, but it's the short story. And then Gorky, famous in a letter he wrote in 1900, Gorky famously wrote to Chekhov. Well, it's become famous now because scholars have written about it. Wrote to Chekhov about his story in Russian, Dama Sabachki, translated into English variously, the lady with the little dog, the lady with the lap dog, because English doesn't have a good equivalent for the diminutive Sabachka. Gorky said, with that story, you killed realism. And I think what he meant by that was gone was the whole framework that told us how to understand life. And Chekhov just shows, and it's a Chekhov story, if anyone knows it, I trust people do, it's a rewriting of an adultery plot, so a rewriting on some level of Anna Karenina, but there's no moral judgment of any kind. There's no teaching us what life is about, and the affair doesn't end. Nobody throws herself under a train, and just this is life, and it's a mess, and it goes on. And that's what life is, with no definitive, again, framework for understanding this and reckoning with this by moral standards. And then, thinking of the transition to modernism, a rewriting of that story could be considered Nabokov's 1937 story, in Russian, Vesna Fiatia, Spring in Fialta, where it all happens on the level of the text. It is life is text, a rewriting of the text. The narrator meets a woman with whom he's had a series of adulterous encounters over the years, but it turns out that the real love affair is his memory of it, which is like a literary text. So that's a shift from realism to maybe early modernism to Nabokov's modernism. the late 19th and early 20th century is obviously a period of absolutely magnificent efflorescence of the arts in Russia, not just literature. You have the advent of the Silver Age and Silver Age poetry, but also then the avant-garde, Russian futurism. Not that these movements were in any kind of harmony among themselves. I mean, the futurists were out to shock and scandalize everybody. But then you also had brilliant painting being produced, avant-garde painting, as well as music, ballet. The Ballet Russe, even though it was largely touring in Europe, was still a Russian phenomenon. And what exactly explains that, I don't know. But it's a magnificent achievement. I don't know that I'm biased because of my interest in Russian, but I don't know that it's matched by any other culture across the arts: painting, music, literature, drama. And then, of course, for a variety of reasons, in particular, World War I, and then the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, that changes. So, Michael, if you're asking about the transition to the Soviet period, the first part in the 20s, and there are various ways of looking at it, and even ways of teaching it, because this came up in a discussion in my department where my colleagues were talking about whether we should maybe change our approach to teaching Russian culture in the 20th century. Now that we are in the 21st century, do we still teach it the same way? And I pointed out to them that I know that a colleague, now deceased, ныне покойная, named Katerina Clark at Yale University, was able to divide the Soviet period into at least three parts. She taught a course which was Soviet literature in the 1920s. Then the 1930s were separate. And then she or somebody else, I assume, did after the death of Stalin, mid-century and on. And we've always had to combine the 1920s and the 1930s. So the course I teach to the graduate students is simply called Soviet Literature 1917 to 1953, but there are fundamental differences. The 20s are really the story of how modernism adjusts to and is tentatively accepted and then suppressed by Soviet literary authorities. And then the 30s with the imposition of socialist realism as the official method, it was called, of Soviet literature, 1934 on. It's a very different cultural world, though there are survivors of modernism even into the Stalin era. But I just find that fascinating, and because I think it says something about me, but I find complexity to be interesting and not things that are simple. I remember when I was in graduate school, and I was what in an American university is called a teaching assistant. I was just a graduate student, aspirant, but I was teaching Russian literature and translation, and I had been teaching Babil, Konarmia, in English called Red Cavalry. And I came back and was talking to my advisor, and I said, I don't understand these students. Babil is so fascinating, and they don't seem to respond. And he said, yeah, because Babil is complex, and students don't like that. They like simplicity. So over the years, I found that I also teach a course on Soviet literature to undergraduate students, meaning in translation, they don't know Russian. The novel they like the most is Fyodor Gladkov, Cement, which I find the most boring thing on the syllabus. I throw it in there just to give them an example of what socrealism was. And I think the reason they like it is it's clear who is good and who is bad. Babil is very ambivalent. I have taught Platonov, about whom I wrote my first book. But in the case of Platonov, if you're going to teach what I consider the most, some of the most really important works as moments in the development of Soviet literature, it's something like Kotlovan, the Foundation Pit in English, or Chivingur. And those are difficult to translate. They're excellent translations that are as good as one could hope for, but a lot is still lost.
Do you teach Foundation Pit in any of your courses?
To graduate students, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about, and there's some scholarship, excellent Russian scholarship, which comments on this, that there's a way in which I don't know how I would label myself. I am a foreigner. I am not Russian, but I think I know Russian pretty well, that it is easier for us to access what is strange about Platonov and his use of language, because the Russian linguistic mind autocorrects. Platonov intentionally misuses things, words, and constructs very strange sentences. And actually a colleague in your area, Olga Mirson, I believe is at George Washington University, commented that native speakers of Russian in their heads correct this, and they have to go back and slowly reread. When Platonov was being published, before he toned down his literary style, mostly, I believe they were women. So I'm going to say the women who were typing his works for, publication, for the clean copy that was produced, demanded extra pay, because with other writers, they could glance at a paragraph, at a sentence, and then just type it. And with Platonov, they had to keep checking, because it wasn't what their mind told them it should be. So I have taught Platonov to graduate students, but I have on occasion taught him to undergraduates. What gets difficult when you get into something as traumatic as Kotlovan is, I think that with students who have very little sense of what something like Stalinism or collectivization might have been like, it's difficult for them to appreciate what's going on.
I can imagine. I mean, that's a whole other topic. What do you do with students now who don't have that memory of the Soviet experience and that period in Russian history? Because it's so important to know that, to understand this.
And I educate them. I tell them I have learned that I cannot simply say something like, well, in the Soviet, for example, we just came up yesterday in class, there's a moment where Vronsky and Anna Karenina is considering taking up an assignment to Tashkent. So I showed them a map, and I was explaining what Uzbekistan is to them. And I said, well, in the Soviet era, and then I realized they don't know what the Soviet era is. So I have to explain to them that it was, the Tashkent Soviet Socialist Republic, now an independent country, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole history of Russian Empire here and so forth. But it's not only that, and I don't know how it is in Russia. I'm hoping it is different. I have found, and I accept, they are virtually ignorant of biblical references. And so I have to explain things to them. And you cannot read, for example, Crime and Punishment without Dostoevsky in general, without knowing something of Russian Orthodox belief. There are old believers mentioned in the novel, and so I find myself almost doing a very brief but a history of Russian Orthodoxy, Russia's conversion to Christianity, then the schism, the Raskol. His name is after all Raskolnikov, Raskol, and so on and so forth. But even basic things, there's a moment in Anna Karenina where Levin decides to go mow with the peasants on his estate. And this is mowing with a scythe. This is hard work. And Tolstoy, that's part of the point. Now, Tolstoy doing this, Tolstoy could enjoy it because for Tolstoy, it was a hobby. You can do it one day of backbreaking labor, but then you don't have to do it tomorrow. But there's a moment where he sits down and they're taking a lunch break with an old man who shares water and bread with him. And I said that Tolstoy clearly intends this as a kind of secular communion, prichestia. Then I realized most of them don't know what that is. So I find myself explaining that, and they're going to get a bit more of this tomorrow when I teach again, because we're covering the scene where Levin and Kitty get married. And I'm going to show them, and Levin goes to the priest, and there's mention of the iconostas and the interior of a Russian cathedral. So they're going to learn about all these things, but they don't come with that knowledge. So teaching Russian literature in America, there seems to be more and more peripheral topics you have to teach them about, not least what was the Soviet Union.
Right.
And which for a person of my advanced age, is hard to imagine. But I realize, when would my students have been born? My students probably were born about 2006. And also my Russian students. I was once, I don't know, I can't hear your audience laughing, but they will probably laugh when I tell you the story. We were discussing, it was a graduate seminar, we were speaking Russian. And I was describing a character, and I said something like, I referred to her as being probably, smazlivaya. And one of my graduate students started laughing. And I said, well, okay, в чем дело, что смешно? Что смешного в этом? And she said, that's a word my grandparents would use. And I said, well, I am the generation of your grandparents. But so it's a good education for me, and I appreciate having the contact with our Russian graduate students because the language has changed considerably since I was really immersed in it. Influx of all sorts of lexicon that simply was not there when I was spending a lot of time in Russia.
So you've taken us from Yevgeny Onegin to the Foundation Pit. We talked about a sea change in the 1880s, Chekhov, cultural changes. What was consistent? What are the through lines that make something Russian? That through all.
That's an interesting question. That is a really interesting question, and well, one obvious one that is often pointed out is the status that literature has within Russian culture. That this matters a lot. As the poet Osip Mandelstam said, poetry matters in Russia. They kill people for it. And that's the negative side of it, but they kill people because they assume that what is written has enormous value. And I was, just in the context, I may go back just to the context of the 19th century, one thing I feel that I need to explain to my students is that there exists in the American popular cultural mind, to the extent that that mind is aware of Russian literature. They tend to think that it is all essentially Dostoevsky, that everyone is strange, everyone, it's all hyperbolic, everyone's nearly insane, and so on and so forth. Crazy Russian writers. And we read Pushkin, and Pushkin is not at all like that. Nor is he religious-minded at all. Pushkin is entirely secular. Turgenev is secular. No religious interest to speak of in Turgenev. And then when we get to the two giants, as it were, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, I keep pointing out to them how very different the Tolstoyan world is from the Dostoevskian world. But I actually thought, what makes these writers both Russian? And I came to class, and I had a slide on this, and I said, for me, what unites them both, for all their differences as Russian, is their maximalism. There's a moment in Crime and Punishment where Raskolnikov, part 2, I believe, he's committed the murder, he's lying in a sort of agitated state, and a character named Luzhin, who wants to marry his sister, is sitting in his room talking, and they're talking about these ideas that were then fashionable, that you no longer have to be charitable anymore, because British utilitarianism has taught us that charity is now actually unnecessary, and every year a certain percentage will go to the devil of people in society. Don't worry about poor people, et cetera, et cetera. And Raskolnikov sits up and he says, well, if that's true, if you carry that to its logical conclusion, you can murder people. And so that's an extreme deduction from the idea that you could manage social policy, statistically. So it's an example of Russian maximism. But in Tolstoy, early on the Karenina, Levin, one of the heroes of the novel, is visiting his half-brother, and there's this discussion going on, which was actually contemporary, about where the dividing line is in human life between what is physiological, what our bodies want us to do, and what is psychological, what our minds tell us to do. Levin, sitting on the sidelines listening to this conversation, thinks, yeah, but what does that have to do with life and death? And I've told them, I did once, I've read English and American literature, obviously, but I remember at one point thinking, I've been reading an awful lot of Russian things. I better read something British. And I picked up, I believe it was a novel by Trollope or something like that. And I just couldn't get more than past about one or two chapters. Nobody had murdered anybody. Nobody was asking ultimate questions. What does it ultimately mean? What does this mean? Okay. What does this mean for life and death? And so I think the maximalism, which is a trait of Russian culture. I've also pointed out to them that we had a very interesting discussion about, and I hope my Russian audience here will agree with me and not chime in and tell me I'm completely wrong about this. We were talking about udal. And I said, okay, this is mostly untranslatable. I'm trying to explain this to them. And I said, the best way for me to explain it is that it's not that Russian culture encourages or condones something like reckless gambling, even though Dostoevsky, gambled and lost and had to conclude contracts for future books just so he could pay off gambling debts. And there's a lot of discussion in Russian novels about it. It's not that the culture condones that or encourages it, but it understands it. It understands risk-taking. Life is something potentially brief and uncontrolled by us, and therefore, why not? And in response to that, one of my students said, well, I think there should be, why is it not the case that, why don't people go to Las Vegas, United States, Nevada, gambling capital of the United States? Why don't they go to Las Vegas and just decide, when I win $500, I am going home? And I said, even in American culture, the reason Las Vegas is there with all those big glittering hotels is not that most people win and go home. It's because they lose lots of money. But that openness of the Russian character, which is I think a very endemic trait, as I see it in Russian culture. The other thing we've talked about in my classes, which is an interesting paradox also, the Russian ambivalence, and I hope I'm not being inaccurate about this, towards wealth. And so at various points we were talking about, I'm telling them about Sergei the Saint, Sergei Rodonyezhsky, who gives up everything and goes and lives in the wilderness and founds a monastery, which is now Holy Trinity Monastery outside of Moscow. And I said, there's a deep, and this was relevant to Crime and Punishment and the attitude towards wealth and the feeling that this is something that you give up. And on a lesser note, a funny note, there's a moment in Anna Karenina where Oblonsky's wife, Dolly, is upset. She's gone from looking at her children as angelic and model children, and then they're misbehaving, and it says, Grisha was whistling. And I asked my students, why is this bad? Why should this upset her? And they couldn't answer. But in another class where we were talking about the reason is historical. I would wager that a lot of Russians don't themselves, they know that it is improper to whistle in a home. I can remember my own son being told, "Не свисти в доме," don't whistle in the house. The reason is culture. It's that the Russian home used to always have an icon in it. And an icon is sacred. And so the space in front of the icon is sacred space, and you do not do something frivolous like whistling. And I was once explaining this to a class on Russian culture, and a student in my class who was from Russian background started laughing. And she said, all my friends when I was growing up thought my family was so strange because they would not. I said, no, there's a very respectable cultural reason why you don't whistle. Anyway, I've strayed, Michael. Bring me back to what you want to talk about.
That's interesting. So then that maximalism, or that sort of take on how Russian authors sort of present life and death scenarios and these important, how did that translate into the 20th century, into the Soviet era? What were the examples there?
Well, clearly, again, it's the centrality of literature. When Stalin and the newly formed Union of Soviet Writers are deliberating about, what they're deliberating about is what kind of literature should Soviet writers be producing. And then they come up with this sort of strange formula called socialist realism. But, I sometimes tell my students, just imagine if in the United States, Congress, the Senate, was deliberating about what kind of American literature, this just would not happen. So it's the centrality of literature as an instrument used or abused to shape people's minds. Stalin called writers engineers of the human soul. And it's the centrality of that literature that is continuous into the Soviet era, as well as the dissident literature that then recorded opposition at great risk sometimes, or published abroad, published in secret, and so forth. So it's the centrality of literature that remains. Now, that may also have changed in more recent years because there's been such an influx of other media that are influential. One thing I've discovered about my students, quite apart from it being Russian literature, is that I sense they don't know how to read a novel. It's very long, but in Russian culture throughout the 20th century, novels were very important. And I think, again, for that reason, appropriated by the Soviet state as a very important instrument for shaping people's understanding of where they were.
So at the turn of the century, so I'm making some references to your book, which when I get to in a second, but we talk about, you talk about the turn of the century, the apocalyptic mood, the sort of heaviness of that period and the uncertainty of the future. What was the state of literature at that point when people are expecting or anticipating or worrying about the end of history or the end of the world, as it were? It sounds like a very difficult time to have to be reading literature that so aggressively goes after these big life and death questions.
It does, but then, if literature is the way you go at life and death questions, if the mood is that the world is going to end soon, where else to incorporate this but in literature? And then part of what the book is about, of course, is that other theater in particular enters in, and you decide that what you really should be doing is somehow you take possession of the here and now, but then you do so in order to arrange basically the apocalypse or the advent, the intervention. Something from some other realm must come and enter into this world. And that's what culture or theater is for. You take theater outside of the building and you take it to the streets. And this was not unique to Russia. This was, Russia was really responding initially to currents, trends in Europe, across Europe, in this apocalyptic mood, which also was not unique to Russia in the 1890s, 1900s, an expectation that the end was coming.
Can you give
us
give us a brief synopsis of your book, Staging the Absolute? and the themes in there. And specifically, what do we mean by intervention?
Intervention, that's an interesting question because my publisher wanted to know about that too. What do you mean intervention? And let me maybe describe how I came on the idea of this book. I was reading The Master and Margarita, and I thought there's something going on here beyond just the literary qualities. I sensed, and I was not the first person to realize this, there's excellent scholarship that precedes me on Bulgakov's reliance on a replication of a form of ritual called the mystery play. And I remember reading Master and Margarita and thinking, there's something else here than novelistic. It's a mystery play interacting with Stalinist culture. So then I started going back and trying to figure out how this had happened. And
mystery play, excuse me. So mystery play, this is
the medieval. It was a medieval religious theatrical practice in which, in a European city, you staged a variety of religious dramas. It could be the Nativity, the birth of Christ, or the Passion. That was a very important one as well, the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ. And as I comment in the book, I think Dostoevsky, who mentions this, in The Brothers Karamazov, at the point where Ivan is going to introduce his tale of the Grand Inquisitor, he introduces it by saying, they used to do this in the Middle Ages in Europe. They would stage these dramas where suddenly God or the Virgin Mary or somebody appears. And so part of the point of the book is that these Soviet rituals really partake of something that is broadly present in European culture. This is not just something strange, peculiar to Soviet or Stalinist culture. It's a desire, if you go from the 19th century to the 20th century, in the 19th century, you want to explain everything in terms of this life, how things change over time in this life. No appeal. Well, Dostoevsky obviously is a little bit different, but largely no appeal to some other realm, which was true of European culture prior to the Renaissance. You're always thinking about your relation to the divine realm. And in the 20th century, that changes. And there's a feeling that has exhausted itself, that we must await, we must expect something coming from somewhere else, God or the devil, and intervening, interrupting the course of history to change it. And the basic argument of the book, although I'm trying to do some other things as well, is that when the Russian avant-garde initially picks this up, and then also Soviet authorities embrace these dramatic forms, large spectacles played out in cities that transform that space into something awaiting the arrival of higher meaning, that comports with it. It brings with it something that was embedded in the genre to beginning, which is the expectation of judgment. And that, because this is what Dostoevsky's point is in that little passage, he says, well, the Virgin Mary appears in order to pass judgment on everybody. Tell who you're good, you're bad, you're evil, you're going to hell, you're good, you're going to heaven. And that this lent itself to shifts in Soviet culture in the Stalin era that eventually led to the show trials in the 1930s. I'm not arguing that it caused them, but it laid the groundwork on which the show trials made cultural sense. We're used to rituals. We're used to rituals that are eschatological. They elevate us above this life. Oh, now we can have a ritual that elevates us above this life. I'm not speaking for the Soviet populace. I'm speaking for the Politburo. Now we can have a ritual that elevates us above this life, and we judge these people who are evil and need to be exterminated and so forth. So that's the sort of dark end. And I address this in the book. I don't see my argument as being identical to an argument made by an emigre scholar named Boris Groys, which is essentially that the avant-garde is to blame for Stalinism, because the avant-garde wanted to take over the world and reshape it as a work of art. And this is essentially what Stalin did. But it's not dissimilar from that.
So let's go back to A Master and Margarita then. Mm-hmm. So this is an example of an intervention where the devil intervenes, comes to Moscow with his entourage. How does that fit into sort of this literary timeline?
There's a widespread, and the book goes into this. One publisher to whom I showed the book said, "Why don't you?" You said, "Yeah, but why don't you write a book about Faust in Soviet culture?" And I said, "Well, I've written this book, maybe later." But so there was a lot of interest, and Faust was a very important literary work, drama, present in educated people's minds in this era. So nobody needed to say, Faust, what was that? What was that? I remember both the opera by Gounod as well as Goethe's drama was very well known, and that was the preeminent example of the devil appearing. Bulgakov clearly is rewriting that. His references are mostly to the opera, and not only in Master and Margarita, it's there in a number of other works. And Belaya Gvardia, for example, it's mentioned explicitly. Along with that, there were a number of works shorter than the Master of Margarita that imagined the devil showing up in the Soviet world. Typically for satirical effect, because the devil exposes vices, which is also how Bulgakov uses that figure.
Do you mean there were Bulgakov's other short works brought in the
by
devil?
Bulgakov, but also by other writers.
Other writers. Yeah, cool. So then you had mentioned the idea of these mystery plays, the spectacle. Like you talk in your book about the theatrical staging. In Master and Margarita. Of the magic. What is it about that kind of sort of magical, supernatural element that appealed to people? I guess to Bulgakov, because people weren't reading his book at this time. But what is it about that supernatural part that was so interesting to them?
There are two eras in which that's significant. One is when Bulgakov wrote it, because he did not publish it, as I'm sure you know, when he wrote it. It was written for the drawer, as they say. And what I argue in the book is that Bulgakov is confronting the Stalin era with its real preoccupations, not the ones that were on the surface in Pravda and Izvestia and so forth. It really is dealing in almost this demonic kind of religious ritual kind of stuff. But there's an excellent article by Alexander Weil and Guinness called Bulgakovsky Переворот, the Bulgakov transition turnover, which argues that it had its real impact on Soviet Russian literature in the 1960s, when suddenly people could read it. And I think the fascination with it was the supernatural, which had been so, at least officially, eliminated from official culture, which was atheist. Suddenly, and as you probably know, I don't know the current status of the devil Volan's apartment on Sadove through to Bis, whether there was a time when there was graffiti there with all of the characters from the novel. I don't know if that's been painted over or preserved, but I think there was such a hunger for something other than drab atheist materialism. And then it's a lot more seductive if it's the devil, because you're not longing for more piety. Right. You're longing for rebellion, and the devil, I think, embodies that. I see questions, Michael. Should I respond to these?
There are a couple questions. Yeah. How did Russian culture at the turn of the 20th century differ from West European culture, and what exchanges or influences can be seen between them? So that comparison between East and West.
That's a big question. The short answer is there was a lot of similarity and influences, and Russian writers in particular were reading French, German, British writers. The only honest thing I could say is I would have to think about what makes it different. Again, the sort of coming out of the whole tradition of the 19th century Russian novel was different with that, again, a grandiose, moralizing or spiritual striving, that was largely lacking in Western European culture. I would have to think about that to give a more complete answer. What exchanges are influenced? Again, there are exchanges all over the place, back and forth. And you only have to take a writer like Vladimir Nabokov, who requires extensive footnotes to read because he's so allusive, referring to European literature all over the place. So Russian literature in the early 20th century was not as closed off as it was, as it became in the 1930s and 40s. Can I recommend some Russian works from the 19th through the 20th that are available in high-quality English translations? There are good translations of Chekhov, his short stories. There are good translations of Babil. Depends on how you define early 20th century. Again, one problem is that genre that comes to the fore is poetry, which is very difficult to translate. I would say Babil, Chekhov, Gorky, and then depending on where if you extend into the 20th century, Zoshenka, one of my favorite writers of the 1920s, and I mean, he wrote after that, but Zoshenka's works of the 1920s.
I was going to ask you, which authors are you most drawn to, just personally, from the early 20th century?
I was fascinated by early 20th century Chekhov. I teach these ponderous, baggy monsters. That's a phrase Henry James applied to Russian novels because they're so big, they're baggy monsters. He meant elephants. I teach all these elephants, and I absolutely love Chekhov because he's so unbaggy and unponderous and so subtle and ambivalent. I absolutely, from my own reading, I love reading Chekhov, but I also love Zoshenka. Again, Zoshenka famously did not like big novelistic forms and wrote very short, witty stories. So I suppose I incline towards short, witty, ironic stories from my own reading. But then Platonov, who's not quite early 20th century, for me with Platonov, I think I tell this story in the forward to that book. I ran into he was a Russian emigre in Ithaca, New York, where I was doing my graduate work. And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to figure out what to write my dissertation about." And I haven't come up with anything yet. And he said, "Have you read Platonov?" And I said, "No, who's Platonov?" He said, "No, это нечто. This is something. You really should read Platonov." I immediately went, and the language was so strange that I had to figure this out. So that's what set me off on that path. I also, though, you mentioned, Michael, my interest in Polish things. I do a lot of reading in Polish literature. Bruno Schulz is a favorite author in Polish, but that's a different opera, as they say.
Opera. What about Silver Age poets? Does that figure prominently?
I've largely detoured around Silver Age poets. I mean, I read them and admire them, and I will, from time to time, tell my students about them. And if I can't remember what the connection was, but I remember telling them about Akhmatova and Brodsky, because we were reading Crime and Punishment, and Brodsky has a lovely passage about the influence of Petersburg architecture on the human mind, which is very different from how Dostoevsky did it. So I'm always opportunistically using these moments to tell students more about Russian culture than they thought they were going to get. So there's a little moment in Dostoevsky, Raskolnikov looks at Petersburg and feels alienated. And I said, no, that's not the only way to respond to it. Here's Brodsky, a lovely passage it's an essay called A Guide to a Renamed City, about the idea that Petersburg architecture instills a sense of order and proportion. And you need this as you go through the world and so forth. So I work in things that I can.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you, Michael. And audience, I have not seen, but thank you for your patience.
Well, no, it's been fascinating and educational. Thank you for being here.
And a delight to talk. Delight to see you again, Michael.
Yes, you too. Okay. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. And have a great day.
Thank you. Evening over there, yes.
Evening over there, yes.